we have the honor to have with us Alí Αχμαντί, who is an executive fellow at Geneva Center for Security Policy. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's start, first of all, with your prediction. Are you optimistic for the next rounds of talks in Islamabad between USA and Iran? What can we expect this time? Because the first round had as the result the blockade, the American blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, so I can't say I'm particularly optimistic about the prospects for diplomacy right now. Coming into the ceasefire, it seemed like the two sides had done a lot of back channel negotiating and arrived at somewhat of a framework that could be the basis for talks. In Islamabad, the things were different. The United States had a lot more demands than it had initially said that it would at these talks. There was demands for Iran's enrichment to be shut down. And so if we're going to completely open the nuclear file, I don't think there's much chance of success. The hope initially was that a structure for future nuclear talks can be established, but that in this phase, in the Islamabad talks, we just get to a ceasefire, Iran gets some sanctions relief, we create some sort of framework for the governance of the Strait of Hormuz, and then we kick the can down the road on everything else. That can be negotiated a more stable environment. If the United States is maintaining the same posture that it did in the last round of talks, I don't think it's going to go forward very well. President Trump was on Fox Business Channel a couple of days ago saying that he doesn't want just 80% of what he wants. He doesn't want 90 or 95% of what he wants. He wants 100% of what he wants. So, obviously that posture does not really lend itself to diplomatic conflict resolution.
First of all, we don't know what Mr. Donald Trump really wants, because every day he changes what he wants, or he's repeating it, but in a different way, changing something in it. So do you think that this tactic, we don't know if it is a state of mind, his state of mind creates such a situation, such a blur situation? Do you think that this kind of tactic, to say one day something, the next day something different, and Iranians really cannot understand what he really means and what he really wants? Because first of all, it was the uranium, the problem, then it was the missiles, then it was the Hormuz, etc., etc. The leadership, it was the regime change, he was saying in the beginning. Now he has forgotten that, and he's saying that there is a regime change. So do you think that this tactic helps the negotiations, or it backfires the negotiations, the way Donald Trump behaves in the diplomatic field?
Well, I mean, having a stable diplomatic position that can change based on negotiations in the room is quintessential to arriving at a diplomatic solution. If the other side never really knows what you want, and assumes, rightfully so, that your diplomatic position is going to shift radically from one week to the next, it's really hard to come up with anything. And we've seen this really for the last year in the various kinds of diplomatic interactions there have been between Iran and the US, where the US essentially has two kinds of negotiating positions, either in a hardline maximalist position that even the Bush administration from 20 years ago would have thought was too extreme, or a more reasonable negotiating posture that seems to evaporate the second Iran actually starts interacting with it. So once again, we're seeing kind of the same thing, where to get the ceasefire, the US agreed to go by Iran's 10 points of how they feel they need to go forward. Now, that was kind of a wish list on the Iranian part. Iran wasn't really expecting to get all of that. But then at the negotiations in Istanbul, all of a sudden, all of those previous hardline demands return, and it makes it impossible to see where things are going from one week to another. I think we're going to have another round in Islamabad. There's been some talk about moving it somewhere else, largely because of logistical matters having to do with the US delegation. But I at this point, unless something specific happens, I don't see a diplomatic breakthrough happening.
So tell me something, which is the real goal of the Americans, of the USA? And what about the factor of Israel? How can Israel implicate, backfire the whole procedure of the negotiations and the talks in Islamabad? Do we have can we describe precisely the real goals of the United States right now?
Well, I mean, I think that getting to making the compromises required for diplomatic resolution is just not something the Trump administration has really been willing to do, even if they've signaled on occasion that they'd be open to it. And so I don't see them doing it here. Now, from the framework of like the Iranian military, the way they look at it is that you can't pay attention to what Trump says, you only pay attention to troop movements. And what we're still seeing is more troops and more military resources being brought into the Middle East rather than taken out of the Middle East, whether from the United States or
it is said 10,000 more soldiers that are heading right now to Middle East. American soldiers, the Pentagon announced that.
Right. They're announcing several blocks of new soldiers. The problem is that they don't really have you can't really conduct a land invasion of Iran the way you would have been able to do with Iraq in 2003, because you can't amass troops on the Iranian border, because there's no way to sort of stop no way to conduct fire suppression against Iran. Iran's going to be able to fire missiles and drones at whatever American forces are in its general proximity. So you're talking about airborne invasion, which is extremely dangerous. You're talking about sea amphibious invasion, which is a lot of the American soldiers are going to get killed just on their way to approaching Iranian territory. So this is why a lot of these invasion options have been kind of ruled out over the course of the last month. And now the Trump administration is they're setting up perhaps some other options that seem equally ill-advised. There's talk about, well, maybe this is just to build leverage in pursuit of a diplomatic negotiation. And in fact, if the Trump administration does want to actually back down on some of the things that they want and get to a diplomatic resolution, they are going to need some sort of narrative that says, oh, well, we intimidated the Iranians into backing down, if anything, for the sake of their own domestic politics. But at this point, I don't see how I see the interdictions at sea and the blockade continuing. I see perhaps some strikes from the United States, but I don't see them being able to actually conduct a kind of land invasion of Iranian territory without giving up massive losses. And with respect to the Israelis, I mean, the introduction of Israel at every step into the decision-making loop in the United States has been decisive. I mean, it's the New York Times reported that it was, after talking to Bibi Netanyahu, as Trump does, it seems every day at this point, and has been for months, that he decided to backtrack on the ceasefire agreement that he had made with Iran and decide that he wants the more hardcore set of demands. So, and this happens all the time. Bibi Netanyahu talks to Trump, or he comes to Washington, and all of a sudden, sort of the hardcore maximalist position of the United States reasserts itself. And this is how Israel has historically managed to keep the United States out of diplomatic agreements with Iran, is basically convincing Washington to take positions that will just not be acceptable under any circumstances.
So you don't think very possible American boots on the Iranian ground then? And you believe this is not something that the Pentagon and the United States will decide finally, because it will be a problem for them. So what can we expect if the next round of talks in Islamabad will not go well, and if the war begins again? How long can it last? And is the time unlimited for Iran? How long can sustain? If the war restarts, how long can Iran survive?
Sure. So first of all, I should say, in terms of land invasion not being an option, it's not a rational option, but that kind of depends on how rational this White House is. In terms of if the war restarts, the thing is that what Iranian military strategists assumed going into this war, and they've been preparing for this basically since June, is that the United States has certain kinds of boutique weapons that it is most effective in trying to target Iran, but it has very small quantities of them, and it's going to run out. Especially when it comes to air defense missiles, which Israel has already run out of its top air defense missiles, basically being protected by American naval air defense missiles from the sea. And you have a lot of their cruise missiles, a lot of their offensive missiles are also having similar problems, a lot of airframe exhaustion among some of their key planes. And so how long the US can actually maintain a high tempo of attack against Iran isn't necessarily clear. For example, the JSSM cruise missiles that are the sort of the workhorse of the US strikes against Iran over the last month and a half, they had about 2,500 of them to start with, and now they have 400 left, or they might have some more stocks left in the Middle East. So this is kind of an issue where this is why the Trump administration, I think, needed a ceasefire, is because they could not keep firing at that tempo without completely running out of their stocks. Iran, on the other hand, has maintained a slow simmer of strikes against Israel with its medium-range ballistic missiles, and still has, out of an initial stockpile of, I think, maybe 2,300, has equipped roughly, most people put it at about 1,700 medium-range ballistic missiles left just to fire at Israel. The short-range ballistic missiles it can fire at the GCC and all of its drones, many of whom can reach Israel, it has roughly unlimited amounts of them. 15,000 missiles, 45,000 drones. So Iran's estimation is that they need to be able to keep up the fight for 6 months, and they don't believe that the US can do that. Maintaining a stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's Iran doing it or Iran and the United States doing it with their separate blockades, is going to be disastrous for the global economy. There's the WTO the IMF rather, put out a report yesterday talking about what effects this would have. And in the short term, you're going to have loss in growth, you're going to have some inflation. But if this goes on till the end of this month, or if it goes on for months afterwards, if the oil shock continues for 2 months, not that big of a deal. It's going to take 6 months to get through all the problems, but it's manageable. If it goes on for 4 months or 6 months, you're talking about potentially global recession and inflation close to 6% globally. So this is how manageable is this really for the United States and the world? Is Iran is betting that it is.
So how do you explain Iran's unexpected resilience, really unexpected? Were they well prepared after the war with Iraq? They were already from then. They were prepared very well after the 12-day war in last June. And what about their missile stockpile? Is it hit by the American strikes, or not? The stockpile remains a big one.
Yeah, so in terms of the stockpile, obviously a lot of this is shrouded in military secrecy. So we have an idea of how many missiles Iran had before the war and how many it's fired. In terms of damage to Iran's so-called missile cities, these underground large labyrinths where Iran both builds missiles and also fires that from them, there doesn't seem to have been a massive amount of damage done to these missile cities, just because they're often, Iran is a very mountainous area, and a lot of these missile cities are buried underneath granite mountains. So you would see instances where local people from a certain area would report hearing explosions for 10 minutes on end, because the US and Israel were pounding a missile city as hard as possible. And then a few hours later, the same missile city would start firing missiles again. So Iran has done a good job of creating all these fortifications for its most important weapons, for some of its air defenses that have been left that make it very difficult for the US to try to get planes over Iran with any kind of sustainable way, and for its missiles. In terms of how Iran prepared for this, I mean, this really goes, you can say it goes back to the Iran-Iraq War, in a sense that Iran learned during the Iran-Iraq War, when fighting the United States directly, as it did in the naval battles, that the United States is very good at taking out Iran's marquee sort of bigger ships, but it really struggles against small boats, like fleets of small boats. Now you fast forward that a few decades later, and you have the drone revolution. So from the 2010s on, even a little bit before that, Iran really started focusing on cheaper drones and missiles that it could build and use in very large quantities to overwhelm the much smaller number of highly sophisticated weaponry that the United States has. And that's the strategy that's kind of paying off right now.
Do you think that Iranians have their own war style, their own war strategy? And which are its characteristics? Because there are historians who talk about their historical past, etc., and that who can fight them? They are a civilization. Of course, Donald Trump wanted to destroy it in one night.
Sure.
a civilization that goes back when they were battling with the Greeks, and they were, so how can they win, Iranians? Do you see that there is a link? There is a historical background to their armed war strategic they have today?
Sure. I mean, I think part of it is, and this is it's a very complicated conversation as to how Iran's history of the Persian civilization interacts with a sort of religious aspect of things that the government holds. Some of those two things actually go together quite well. But so if this was, we saw, for example, in the case of Venezuela, which is a big part of why Donald Trump became confident that he could do this. Venezuela is a much younger country. It doesn't have a very long civilizational history. With Iran having that long civilizational history, it knows that it can endure and that it could repel foreign, and this is just a chapter in its sort of longer history. So you have that sort of influence as well. But with regards to the fighting style, there's in the United States, especially during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of talk about, Oriental war making, as they called it, this kind of asymmetrical means by which Eastern countries tend to engage in war versus the Western style of war, which is more about, large armies meeting each other in the battlefield. Now, for a long time, for over thousands of years, Iran and the Persian Empire, Greece, Rome, they fought each other, and very often in very similar ways. But what you have now is Iran essentially taking inspiration, understanding that it's from a military technology and financial standpoint, it is weaker than the United States, obviously the global superpower, and then looking at Vietnam, looking at a lot of different cases in which there's resistance against larger powers, and then thinking, okay, how do we as a country with the resources and institutions of the country, how do we learn from that and adapt that to our own strategies? And that's kind of what you're seeing now. An insurgent group wouldn't be able to develop a Shahid drone or the Khaybar-Shikan missile, which splits into 20 different missiles and becomes impossible to intercept. So translating those lessons into what a state can do is sort of a cornerstone of this thinking, the doctrine behind the strategy.
Which side has studied better Thucydides? Thucydides. Yes.
Yeah, Thucydides. Yeah. Yes, as a Thucydides, I would say more of a fan than an expert on Thucydides, but yeah, I mean, certainly Iran. In terms of military strategy and doctrine, Iran being the weaker power certainly felt the need to study strategy and figure out how to do these things. Whereas from the U.S. side, it was clearly meant to be just, the U.S. fired 5,000 munitions at Iran in the first 96 hours of the war. I mean, just an intense, unprecedented scale of firing, which shows that they really expected this to be over very soon. They expected shock and awe Iran into submission. They did not expect this longer war. And that's, in fact, what Mοχσέν Νιζάι, who's a IRGC former commander and Iranian politician, said on Iranian television, I think maybe 3 or 4 days into the war. He said, the mistake the Americans and the Israelis made is that they thought this would be a short war. We're prepared for a long war. And this is kind of that slow grind is how the strategy works.
So then Iran can continue with a war of attrition. And can we see the worst scenario of the developments, the war in Iran to become like the war in Ukraine and continue and become the war of a generation, as some analysts say?
Well, I mean, the problem from the American standpoint is that there is only one country in the entire world in which this war is popular, and that is Israel, not the United States. This war is incredibly unpopular in the United States. And so, and of course, with unpopular in Europe, unpopular in East Asia. And so for the United States, the idea of grinding this war on for months and years is just not viable, because at a certain point, the animosity towards it in the United States is going to be too much. This war was supposed to be won by a massive, immediate show of force, which is something the American president can do unilaterally. He can just start a war, start bombing, empty the stockpiles, and maybe send small numbers of special forces. Once you're talking about a much larger military campaign that spans a very long time, at least from a standpoint of congressional military authorizations, they need to allocate the funds for this. The Pentagon has said they want $200 billion for this war. That's going to be very difficult, even if some Democrats who are very pro-Israel want to go along with this. the approval rating for this war among the base of the Democratic Party is almost nothing. So it's going to be very difficult for them to support any of this. And America is still, maybe not a democracy in the way we Americans would have thought of themselves 20 years ago, but it's not really it's not Russia either. Trump can't unilaterally do everything.
So Israel cannot continue the war by its own against Iran?
Not really. Not for an extended period of time. So what we saw during the 12-day war, which is the war back in June, is that Israel can mount sustained airstrikes on Iran, but only with a significant amount of American support with regards to, say, intelligence or targeting, but also refueling. I mean, the Israelis are reliant on America for refueling craft that will refuel their fighter jets, because their fighter jets don't have the range to get all the way to Iran. They really need the U.S. to refuel their aircrafts over Syrian, Iraqi airspace or Saudi Arabian airspace. They need logistical support from the United States. So without a spectacular amount of support from the United States, they cannot sustain strike. They can maybe do a strike here and there, but not sustain strikes. And then the other thing is air defense. I mean, the Israelis are entirely reliant on the United States for air defense at this point. And so how long you can keep that up, and at what point do Iran start attacking U.S. forces and forces in the region for going along with this, for participating in this? Iran did purportedly fire missiles at Diego Garcia. There was a drone strike in Cyprus, at the UK base in Cyprus, which are very important logistical nodes for U.S. operations on these things. So it cannot carry on a war indefinitely. Certainly not by itself. Even with American support, it's limited.
So if there will be an escalation, then can you see also Greece interfere, European countries interfere? Mainly, I'm interested about your opinion for Greece.
Yeah, so Greece is already involved, somewhat tangentially perhaps, but it's involved because I did not know any of this before this war started, but apparently there's a Greek Patriot system in Yanbu, in the Saudi Red Sea ports, that is the terminal through which the Saudis export oil into the Red Sea. And so Iranian forces had already fired on that before the ceasefire set in, and they managed to hit a couple of positions in Yanbu, but the Greek forces there said they had intercepted other forces. Why there's a Greek Patriot battery there, you might be able to explain it to me better than I did not know about this until recently. But so because of where the war is, Greece itself, outside of that particular Patriot force, ends up playing a very significant role as a logistical hub, both Greece and Cyprus, for American forces. And the use of Greek airspace is very important. And so Greece has unfortunately been thrust into this by virtue of its NATO membership. And I don't think Greece is really interested in getting drawn into this kind of war. And from a European standpoint more broadly, I mean, we have a situation here where the refineries have said in about 2 weeks, they will no longer be able to guarantee jet fuel being able to. So you're going to have to see a lot of flight cancellations to cope with that. A lot of diesel is not going to come in. These kind of companies around Europe have already been battered by, coronavirus and then the Russian war, and now this. So there is already a lot of problems in Europe, and a lot of Europeans who were initially maybe somewhat supportive of this war in terms of European leaders have turned against it. You can look at the tensions between President Trump and Giorgia Meloni in Italy right now that comes from this, as well as Trump's bizarre attacks on the Pope.
So that means that Greece, that expects a lot from its tourism during summer, will have problems and will pay the cost of this war that is in a way supporting. And do you think that it was wrong from the Greek government to be with the side of Americans and to participate in this war? And Greece should have taken the same stance that Spain, for example, took?
Yeah, I mean, I think every European country should have taken the stance that Spain took. It was really a heroic position by President Sanchez to kind of put himself out there like that, and it's definitely paid off. A lot of Europeans are coming around to the same position. Yeah, you make a good point about Greece's tourism economy is going to be very heavily hit by both the general economic ramifications in terms of, when growth goes down, so do wages. Less people want to spend money on vacation, but also jet fuel is going to be a huge problem. Right now, it's selling for about $200 a barrel, which is much higher than crude. So if the effects of this economic crisis, even if it ended today, will continue into the summer and make things more expensive. If it goes on for considerably longer, would be considerably worse. And yeah, I mean, I think with Greece, I don't think Greece really ever, I'm certainly not an expert on Greek politics. I don't think Greece would have wanted to participate in a war like this. The problem that Greece has, to some extent, the problem that at least some of the GCC countries, the Arab countries below the Persian Gulf had, which is they have these security relationships and partnerships and contracts, which obliges them to allow the United States to use certain bases, certain storage facilities, so their airspace. And so a lot of countries have to rethink what this means as we get into a much more unstable period in international relations. And Donald Trump is going to be president for another 3 years. So a lot of NATO countries and countries that have security relationships with the US have to think about what these contractual obligations mean moving forward.
So you just referred to the Arab countries of the Gulf, the GCC. Do you think that they rethink their relationship with USA? Because as we can see for years, the Arabian Peninsula relied on the US umbrella that but it was proved leaked lately. So do you think that this can change the base of the relationship and that this is one of the things that Iran won from this war?
Sure. I mean, an underlying problem between Iran and the GCC countries has always been that Iran blames the GCC countries for the instability in the Middle East because Iran basically says you keep inviting foreign forces, Western forces, specifically American forces, into the region, and that creates instability problems. So that's always been an issue between Iran and the GCC. Obviously, a lot of the bases the U.S. has in the GCC have been significantly damaged, if not destroyed. There's a New York Times piece about that a couple of weeks ago. So they would need significant refurbishments in order for the U.S. troops to be able to go back in them. But that's certainly something that Iran wanted and felt like it needed to destroy some of these capabilities in terms of how they reflect on this war in particular. In terms of what the GCC is going to have to do, I mean, things are going to have to change, obviously. The U.S. was not able to protect them, a lot of these countries, what unites them is their governance model and the idea that having a U.S. base in your country essentially provides you with perfect security. And that is clearly not the case. Now, how they react to it moving forward, the GCC countries are not a monolith. Oman and Qatar are definitely trying to have a better relationship with Iran moving forward. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and even Kuwait, strangely enough, one of the more moderate countries, have been much more hawkish. Saudi has sent some mixed signals that it does want to kind of reach out to Iran and see what happens. But I mean, the bridges have been burned that, it's kind of hard to imagine outside of, say, the Omani case, how they're going to get rebuilt.
So what will happen with Iran's uranium? We didn't talk about that because it is in the center of the negotiations right now, the talks. What do you foresee that will happen? Will the two sides reach finally an agreement? What will happen? And as I remember, we didn't discuss if the nuclear facilities have been hit in the way the USA and Israel wanted, and in which condition can be.
Right. So in terms of the nuclear facilities were hit by America's most, formidable bunker busters back in June. There has been some strikes around them again this time around. But it's, what shape they're in remains a very closely guarded state secret. So Iranian government officials go back and forth between saying, oh, no, they're actually completely destroyed. You don't need to worry about them anymore, to saying, no, actually, they're perfectly fine. And so obviously there's what comes out of the Iranian government about those facilities, more about strategy in circumstance than probably reflecting objective reality. There are also, other facilities that Iran can build that'll be more defensible against those particular kinds of missiles the U.S. used to strike the facilities last time around. So Iran reconstitutes its nuclear facilities. It's not necessarily clear that it would be the same facilities. It might just reconstitute elsewhere. In terms of, I believe your first question, if you could remind me.
It was about the uranium, Iran's uranium, that it is now the main topic of the negotiations and the talks between the Americans and the Iranians. Yeah.
I think that if Iran is not going to give away pieces of its nuclear program if for anything other than in the context of a comprehensive agreement where the sanctions are also lifted. So the idea of getting Iran's uranium or convincing Iran to make meaningful nuclear concessions in the context of these Islamabad talks that are supposed to be about ceasefire, I don't think that's really going to happen. You could see potentially limited sanctions relief from the United States in exchange for Iran essentially agreeing to, in a sense, halt the nuclear program where it is, not increase it, so that essentially just to make room for nuclear negotiations. That's conceivable, but giving away enriched uranium or shutting down enrichment in exchange for anything other than a comprehensive deal that gives Iran comprehensive sanctions relief, I don't see that in the cards.
So which is the role of China till now to the war in Iran? Is it supporting it in a way that it's invisible to the whole world, but is behind the war and behind the talks in Islamabad, China?
Well, I mean, from a military standpoint, Iran and China certainly have a robust relationship. There are definitely, Chinese parts in Iranian military technology, but whether those have been sold to Iran under military transfer or not is of course something that debated. There's also a lot of talk about China providing Iran with a lot of intelligence to target key vital U.S. assets like the THAAD systems antenna, which is sort of the crown jewel of American air defense. So those Iranian strikes have been very effective. I think most people in Europe keep talking about how Iran managed to get the kill chain to do this, and they talk about Russia, which I understand is obviously Russia's the bigger problem, but China seems to be more involved in that, as far as I can see. Obviously, I can't be sure. But in terms of Islamabad, China has counseled Iran to accept the ceasefire and see what can be achieved through diplomatic negotiation, which is what China has always done with Iran. It's counseled to engage diplomatically with the United States.
So which is the condition at the Iranian leadership right at this moment?
So the Iranian leadership, as far as we can see, you have the Supreme Leadership Council is still active. This included, the president and a few other people who are making the decisions. Largely, the Iranian military obviously has a very outsized role in general, and especially now in a time of conflict. The new supreme leader that was appointed has to sign off on. He's the final arbiter of national security decisions, but the decision making is more decentralized than it was before, and it was already pretty decentralized. The Ayatollah Khamenei, the late Ayatollah Khamenei, wasn't making every decision. He was sort of the chairman of a board, if you will, in these sort of decisions, and many of the people involved in those decisions are still there and still making the decisions. So the decision making cadre is still largely intact.
So the front of Lebanon affects the front of Iran. And what are you right now foreseeing that Israel will decide to do? Because it seems to be totally, it wants to continue the war. So what can we expect? And can we see after everything ends the Middle East to be reshaped in a way?
I mean, I think that with regards to Lebanon, the Israelis can't really stop fighting, because if they ever actually completely stop fighting, then they have to stop and take a survey of what they've actually accomplished after all these years of war, which is not much. But they were supposed to have destroyed Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah during this conflict came back with a vengeance. At some point, they were firing 100 missiles a day at Israel, which is not something, we've been talking about how Hezbollah has been dead for the last year and a half, and that's clearly not the case. Right now, they've invaded parts of southern Lebanon. They're trying to carve out southern Lebanon into 3 sections that they completely control, or that they somewhat control. And they just had a meeting with the Lebanese government in Washington, where the Lebanese government, just by meeting with them, is basically giving credence to the idea that the Israelis have a right to do this. What agreements the Israelis came out of those talks very happy. which is, I don't know exactly what happened in those talks, but judging by how thrilled by it the Israelis were, I don't think that's going to be good news for Lebanon. The Lebanese government is not really supportive of Hezbollah. Lebanon is obviously a kind of a fractured state of Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and the Christians there that are kind of divided among these political lines. And Hezbollah represents Shia Muslims that live in the south, who often feel abandoned by their government. And, in times like this, you can look at that and say, well, it's for good reason. In terms of the larger influence on the campaign, Lebanon was supposed to be a party to the ceasefire. And it was, after, again, Netanyahu made a phone call, and suddenly Donald Trump decided that it was not a party to the ceasefire. And the Lebanese government basically said, we don't want Iran negotiating for us. So this is, the first time in history, I think a country has asked to be bombed for the purposes of its own sovereignty. That they would rather be bombed by Israel than acknowledge owing something to Iran, because this the Sunni population in Lebanon is not necessarily very fond of Iran. It's a very complicated mix. The talks are going to move forward right now, but the ceasefire is technically over on the 21st. It can theoretically be extended, but it's.
But they say that Netanyahu is just buying time with the direct talks, which is news by itself, direct talks between the Lebanese and the Israelis, that he buys time, and that there will be no future from after these talks for any treaty. I don't know.
No, I don't think there will. The Israelis they definitely do not feel like they have to give an inch. And they clearly have plans on colonizing southern Lebanon, or at least parts of southern Lebanon. They're in moving Jewish settlements in that area. So that's definitely what the sort of greater Israel project is. Definitely the attitude the Israelis are going in there with. And Hezbollah has gone all the way back to being the insurgent group that it was back in the 1980s, because Hezbollah was created under Israeli occupation back in the 1980s. So they've kind of gone back to that underground format and are waging a very fierce insurgency in southern Lebanon now. And it's going to be very difficult for the Israelis to ever have real control of the situation. We've already seen tons of Israeli tanks hit. They have Iranian anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons that Hezbollah does. So it's going to be very difficult for the Israelis to actually maintain security control, even if the government in Beirut is sort of deciding that it's fine with that.
Mr. Ahmadi, thank you so much for your time and for this conversation.
It's my pleasure. It's wonderful conversation.
Thank you. We have the honor to have with us Mr. Ali Zadi. Is it right? Ahmadi. Sorry for that. I will start again. So,
no problem.